Hello everyone, and welcome to Correlates, Causes, and the Neurobiology of Consciousness. I'm Joe Neisser, and this is the second Consciousness Online conference. So this will be a PowerPoint presentation, and I won't be on long, but I just thought I'd come on at the beginning and say hello, say greetings, maybe wave, and get things started off. But most of it will be the PowerPoint, which hopefully will function as a kind of extended handout to help create the illusion that we're actually at a conference. So let's just get started. The past 10 years or so have seen widespread agreement among philosophers that neuroscientists are engaged in the search for the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCC. And David Chalmers, in the year 2000, articulated a definition of the NCC concept which was meant to capture the observed relation between the contents of experience and activity in specific neural populations. But his now standard definition is inadequate both to the phenomena of consciousness and to the actual research that it was meant to illuminate. So that's the topic of my talk, and let's get right to it. So in what follows, I first introduce the idea of an NCC as presented by Chalmers, and rehearsed a criticism of it advanced by Noe and Thompson in 2004. I then suggest that the neurobiological research in view should be understood as an attempt to localize the working parts of a complex causal mechanism rather than as an effort to identify the correlates of some discrete conscious content. Thus, the first C in NCC should stand for causes rather than correlates. I conclude by attempting a revised definition of the NCC, and I'm basically going to read the paper, believe it or not, so bear with me. The standard approach to the NCC. David Chalmers describes a research program in neuroscience dedicated to the search for the neural correlates of consciousness, or NCC. Chalmers defined the NCC as follows. An NCC is a minimal neural system N such that there is mapping from states of N to states of consciousness where a given state of N is sufficient under condition C for the corresponding state of consciousness. So I'll focus on kind of research aimed at a particular kind of consciousness, which Chalmers calls content consciousness. Content consciousness is primarily distinguished from creature consciousness, which is a property of a whole animal. Roughly, creature consciousness is the property of being conscious, as opposed to being unconscious, as in a coma. Content consciousness is a property of a conscious state, that it takes an intentional object. This research, then, compares states of the brain in which the subject is unconscious of the stimulus with states of the brain in which the stimulus is consciously experienced. The paradigmatic example of research that aims at discovering the NCC for content consciousness is a set of experiments conducted by Logothetis and Leopold, conducted by Leopold and Logothetis 1996 and Scheinberg and Logothetis 1997. I will pause to describe this research. Logothetis' primate lab was the site of a series of experiments that exploit the phenomenon of binocular rivalry. In binocular rivalry, competing stimuli are presented, one to each eye. The result in consciousness is an oscillation between perception of one stimulus and perception of the other. The subject does not perceive a hybrid composed of both stimuli, but instead experiences a flipping back and forth between the two. As the name rivalry suggests, there is a sort of competition between neural processes in which the winner takes all. Thus, as one or the other of the visual stimuli dominates neural activity, we become. With the use of electroencephalographic recordings, Scheinberg and Logothetis first identified neurons in the visual system of a rhesus macaque subject that respond to particular visual stimuli such as horizontal orientation of a grate or a sunburst. They then trained the macaque subject to report its visual experience by pushing a button upon seeing the preferred stimulus pattern. The stimuli were then presented in a binocular rivalry situation so that the monkey would respond when the preferred stimulus became dominant. Thus, the experimenters had a way to compare neural activation across very specific states of content consciousness. One in which the preferred stimulus is not conscious because suppressed by the rivalry, and one in which it is the winner. And it's a very elegant experimental design. The elegance lies in its ability to isolate the consciousness of a stimulus independently of the presentation of the stimulus. Logothetis et al. Were able to measure the difference in a brain state that co-varies with conscious perception of the stimulus even while stimulus presentation is held constant. With this experimental design, then, these researchers have found a way to work directly in the field that Fechner once called inner psychophysics. Inner psychophysics is the empirical study of the relation between the conscious mind and neurophysiology. Fechner distinguished inner psychophysics from outer psychophysics, which is the study of the relation between the mind and external stimuli. Historically, inner psychophysics had to be studied indirectly through outer psychophysics. Neuropsychologists could not precisely manipulate and measure neural activity independently from external stimulation. So the binocular rivalry paradigm, together with improved microelectrical recording techniques, allows limited but quite direct experimental manipulation of the inner psychophysical relation. The results indicate that there is a significant relation between the winning visual perception and activation of particular neural populations in the inferior temporal cortex and the superior temporal sulcus. When the monkey reported seeing the preferred stimulus, 90% of the pre-identified neurons in IT and STS were strongly active. However, this activity was almost extinguished when the monkey saw the ineffective stimulus. Thus, these seem to be the neurons that make the difference for consciousness of that visual content. Chalmers identified this work as being paradigmatic of the NCC research program and attempted to derive his general definition of the neural correlate from it. And we'll pause here and just take a look at a schematic diagram of the human and macaque visual systems. I've drawn an arrow on the lower diagram pointing to the general vicinity. All right. 1.2, the neural correlate of what? According to Chalmers' definition of the NCC, the neural subsystem N will be sufficient for the occurrence of the conscious state under conditions C. The NCC will be the activation in the smallest or minimal neural system such that when you have the neural activity, you have the content consciousness. Or again, the NCC will be the neural state that is minimally sufficient for the corresponding conscious content. Call this aspect of the definition of the NCC the sufficiency requirement. Since there might be more than one neural subsystem that correlates with a given type of conscious content, and since these multiple neural states might not correlate with one another, Chalmers holds that the notion of a neural correlate should be understood to refer to a neural state that suffices for a given conscious state, but is not necessary for it. But the sufficiency requirement for the neural correlates seems misplaced when considered from a phenomenological point of view. The ceteris paribus clause, under condition C, indicates that the minimal system is sufficient for the conscious content only on condition that everything else is in place, including the further neural conditions for consciousness itself, creature consciousness, background consciousness, and other conscious contents to which it is related. Whenever these conditions obtain, N is held to be sufficient for an experience, and the content of the experience is specified by the activation profiles of N. But phenomenologically, this is an abstraction. The experience, individuated in this way, does not exist as such, but only as part of a global consciousness that clearly does not correlate with N. Something is missing from the NCC if it doesn't actually correlate with any experience. Intuitively, one might construe the identified neural activity simply as a contributor in the genesis of a global conscious experience, ultimately having as one component the particular visual feature to which these cells are attuned, say, horizontal orientation of the great. But in that case, these momentary activations in local neural populations in a visual system, which the definition of the NCC is carefully constructed to pick out, are not sufficient for any conscious experience. What is missing? Consciousness of a particular visual content is always consciousness for some subject. The first-person point of view is part of the experience itself, but is not part of the NCC as defined by Chalmers. In the next section, I'll explore this problem in more detail. Part 2, Noe and Thompson's phenomenological critique of the NCC concept. In 2004, Noe and Thompson argued that the contents of visual consciousness have certain global features that cannot be pinned to the firing rates of neurons in specific areas in the visual system. That is, they hold that the experience and the putative neural correlates do not have one and the same content. The authors list 3 features of experiential content not matched in neuronal receptive field representations. Visual perception is structurally coherent, intrinsically experiential, and active. They conclude that the NCC program is a flawed approach to content. I'll focus on Noe and Thompson's second objection to the notion of the NCC, that consciousness is intrinsically experiential. What they have in mind here is roughly what various philosophers have called subjectivity, or the first-person point of view. They write, perceptual content is intrinsically experiential in the sense that the content of an experience is always the content as represented from a point of view. The analysis of experience as essentially involving a subjective point of view has been a constant theme in the literature. Whenever there is consciousness, there is something it is like, and this is always for some subject. Similarly, the subjective point of view may be said to be an internal structure of consciousness in the sense that what it is like is always experienced from the inside. This means that the first-person perspective is partly constitutive of content consciousness itself. Thus, we cannot just stipulate, as Chalmers does, that we are studying content consciousness rather than creature consciousness, since the latter is an internal structure of the former. Noe and Thompson clarify this point by explaining that their notion of experientiality refers to the way in which experience is perspectively self-conscious. This means that the perceiver and the world enter into the content of experience as background conditions. So the content of experience is always perspectival, and part of the experiential content is that it is perspectival. This perspectival content concerns various possibilities for action from this vantage point, as well as expectations about changes in the point of view that will result. In this way, subjective first-person experience is apprehended as for me, in a way such that I am specified by the structure of the experience itself. So, when Noe and Thompson criticize the NCC program for not taking into account the intrinsically experiential nature of conscious content, they are referring to the well-established phenomenological analysis of the subjectivity of first-person experience. Note, however, that Noe and Thompson also emphatically and repeatedly state that their argument is not directed against neurobiological research on consciousness in general. They only object to Chalmers' assumption that the global contents of consciousness will match or correlate directly with particular receptive field contents in isolated neural populations. They call this faulty assumption the matching content assumption. The matching content assumption is expressed in the definition of the NCC as the requirement that the correlate be sufficient for the contents of visual experience, and this sufficiency requirement was discussed in Part 1. Yet, while Noe and Thompson's critique of Chalmers' definition of the NCC is warranted, the actual research remains utterly unscathed. The experimental design employed by Logothetis et al. Ingeniously identifies neural activity that co-varies with particular features of experience, such as perceptual consciousness of the spatial orientation of a bar. As I pointed out, the binocular rivalry design is essentially a classical experiment in psychophysics. But the sufficiency requirement, or matching content doctrine, stipulated by Chalmers, is unnecessary. A more old-fashioned aim for research in inner psychophysics will still do perfectly well to discover neural activation patterns that predict specific changes in consciousness. Neuroscientist Pierre Glure has argued that today's neuropsychological research methods are essentially continuous with those first devised by Hans Berger in the 1920s and 30s. Quoting, "The experimental condition differs from the baseline condition only with respect to a well-defined psychological function. In this way, those changes specifically related to that function can be isolated from those it shares with the baseline condition." Close quote. It's talking about measuring changes in an ongoing process. In the experiments conducted by Logothetis et al., the subjectivity, or experientiality, of visual consciousness is clearly baseline. In the binocular rivalry situation, there is plenty of conscious experience going on beyond the changes measured. In all the experimental conditions, subjective point of view obtains. and it is independent of binocular rivalry. The well-defined psychological function is the changing perception of the preferred stimulus. The method isolates specific areas activated during a specific and measurable change in conscious visual perception, but this certainly does not mean that other areas are not involved with the global task. So, part 3, the hunt for causes. So the problem with the NCC concept is that the contents of consciousness are always subjective. Even under conditions C, neural activity in IT and STS just is not sufficient for any complete visual experience. But this problem with the NCC concept need not be a problem with neurobiological research on consciousness. Logothetis et al. have succeeded brilliantly in marking one particular neural difference between two complete visual experiences. But there is just no need to interpret this kind of study as attempting to identify a contentful correlate for any actual experience. So where does this leave us? In the final section, I argue that the search for the NCC can be reconceptualized as the search for a highly specialized working part of a complex mechanism that governs global subjective consciousness. INUS conditions in the NCC. J.L. Mackey, in 1974, introduced the notion of the INUS condition in his analysis of causality. The INUS condition is the insufficient but necessary component of an unnecessary but sufficient set of conditions. Thus, a lit match can be the INUS condition for a forest fire, despite the fact that it is neither necessary nor sufficient for the forest fire. In the explanation of the actual fire, the lit match plays a special role within the context of a set of conditions that are jointly sufficient for the fire. And, quoting Mackey, what we call a cause typically is, and is recognized as being, only a partial cause. It is what makes the difference in relation to some background or causal field. Emphasis. Causal claims based on the INUS analysis are to be tested by constructing experimental conditions that manipulate the putative INUS conditions in order to observe what difference this makes in the system as a whole. And in fact, this is a very precise description of the experiments here in view. As discussed, Logothetis et al. Identified the neural activations that make the difference to, and hence are partial causes of, the experience of the preferred stimulus. However, the INUS condition cannot be the essence of the causal relation because it is symmetrical, while causal relations are not. On Mackey's analysis, it will also be true that B is the INUS condition for A. The forest fire is the INUS condition for the lighting of the match, as well as the reverse. In good Humean tradition, then, it appears that the best an INUS analysis can provide is correlation, not causation. But it's important to realize that Mackey offered the INUS relation merely as an analysis of the form of a complex causal relation, which is, at heart, a mechanistic relation. And the INUS analysis can be described as merely part of the empirical method for hunting causes, in Cartwright's phrase, 2007. Mackey, in fact, buttressed his analysis by adding that the INUS condition picks out a cause, and not a mere correlate, only insofar as it identifies an effective relation, or one in which A fixes B, or produces B, etc. Roughly, A effects B when preventing A prevents B. Logothetis' binocular rivalry paradigm is an ingenious way of testing precisely this. The rivaling stimulus intermittently prevents the neural activation, A, and in turn this is shown to prevent the behavioral report. So the terminology of minimal sufficiency lacks the mechanistic meaning of the INUS condition and so misses this salient feature of the research. Seeing Logothetis' research as part of the hunt for causes renders it continuous with the rest of neuroscience. Explanation in neuroscience generally takes the form of a search for mechanisms that underlie cognitive and behavioral phenomena, and these mechanistic explanations are offered on the basis of evidence about manipulability. Carl Craver has argued this in 2007, and several others, Bechtel. This is very much in tune with the idea that the INUS condition identifies causes in terms of their effectiveness. Further, Craver has argued that a neural mechanism offered in an explanation is often held to be partly constitutive of its explanandum. This means that a putative causal mechanism can be explanatory when it is the INUS condition in a system that exhibits the explanandum. The explanandum itself can be a phenomenon observed at another level. Thus, the search for the NCC may be understood as a search for the neural parts of a complex mechanism, an organism, which is conscious. The global and subjective content of consciousness, then, is understood as constituted or enacted at the complex, holistic level of the embodied animal, not at the level of the working neural mechanism that governs it. Now, one more important point must be clarified before I can bring this to a conclusion. I'm not suggesting that this research has the resources to bridge the so-called explanatory gap and to solve the problem about qualia. I follow Levine. We will not have a complete explanation of qualia until we have a functional analysis of what qualia do. But Levine also holds that we can in fact locate the causes of consciousness even in the absence of a functional role analysis of qualia. We can have, and in this case we do have, good empirical reason to believe that particular neural activations are what bring about particular features of experience. There is no conceptual problem in conducting this sort of investigation. What we are at a loss to do is to explain why these neural mechanisms, or any other, should give rise to the particular qualia they do, rather than to some other, or to any at all. Levine even argues that it is precisely our ability to localize the mechanisms of consciousness that motivates the absent qualia and conceivability arguments in the first place. The moment we identify C fibers, say, as the mechanism of pain, we immediately find that we can imagine them working in the absence of qualia. So the explanatory gap argument is not a denial of the claim that C fibers, for example, are the causal mechanism for pain. Rather, it is a denial of the claim that we understand why this should be the case, since we have no analysis that connects what C fibers do with what pain feels like. In addition to our perplexity about the functional role of qualia, Noe and Thompson have shown that we cannot directly map abstracted bits of experienced intentional content to momentary activation in isolated neural populations. And again, to sum up, this is because actual experience is a holistic gestalt, not a patchwork of independent bits, some of them the non-subjective visual bits, and others the subjective bits. There is no non-subjective bit of visual experience to which the activity in IT and STS could conceivably correspond. But there is a precisely measurable difference between the neural conditions that underlie two distinct, globally subjective moments of conscious experience. This research identifies the neural activity that makes the difference between these moments. The relation of making the difference for is better analyzed in terms of the INUS condition than in terms of minimal sufficiency. In turn, the INUS relation is best understood as a causal relation, not as a merely correlative one. Thus, the research aims at localizing the working parts of an underlying mechanism, and in this respect it is continuous with much of the rest of neuroscience, as well as the long tradition of psychophysical research. In light of all this, I'll conclude by attempting a rewrite of the definition of the NCC concept. An NCC is a minimal neural system, N, such that states of N are the partial causes of a distinguishable state of consciousness, where a given state of N, as a working part of an embodied mechanism, is the INUS condition for the effected aspect of the conscious state. Thank you for listening, and that's all I've got. I look forward to the Q&A session.